sense. Is there 100% certainty that you're right? No. The other thing that you have to do is you have to take into account the order of the words. This is extremely important. Say, for example, let's take something like this. Dunchi. Samanyartha in Sanskrit. Some people used to try to translate this thing as a general object. Well, unfortunately, or Artha Samanya rather, I'm going to state Artha Samanya. Unfortunately, that doesn't work. They've reversed the order of the members of the compound. It's a Samanya, a chi, a universal, which is the object, as opposed to dachi, shabda samanya, for example. A universal which is, or which constitutes, or which makes up the word. So you can't say a general object, a general word. No, it's a universal which is. And what's that analysis? It's a karmadarya analysis. This is an example, and I must say, I got hit over the fingers with it myself. I think it was David Ruick, where you just have to say, this is possible and that is not. In other words, how are you taking this compound? You're taking it as a karmadarya. What's the order of the words? And that restricts enormously the field of possibilities that you have. So you don't have any absolute certainty on that there's just one unique understanding, but you have a whole bunch of things which can safely be eliminated. Okay, so much for compounds. It's an art. It's not something that one can, in a sense, get purely theoretically. It's something that comes from practice to quite a degree. Now, I'd spoken of, I want to move on a little bit. I'd spoken of two things where the Sanskrit is important. One being grammatical forms, and I took compounds as an example. I could take other things, but time is moving on. And the second rubric that I mentioned was vocabulary. Vocabulary is, of course, extremely important. Why? Because the Tibetans are, in the case of the sutras, in the case of the Tengyur too, the canonical literature, are basing themselves on actually a fairly standardized system of translation, with a few exceptions. They're basing themselves on the Mahavyutpati and the Jajabampaniba. In other words, the texts which were put together essentially around 800 or so, during the time of Kesache, the reformed language, where it was decided, essentially by royal decree, that such and such a term would be translated in such and such a way. Now, in passing, I might say we're not in that situation. We don't have any autocratic person who has that type of power to decide those types of things. We're in a much more fluid type of situation ourselves, so I don't think we should have the illusion that we can very easily just put together a Mahavyutpati ourselves. But it's extremely important when we're translating to consult the Mahavyutpati, this text, which gives you the Sanskrit Tibetan equivalent, some Chinese too, in the edition of Sakaki. This, by the way, is available on the TBRC resources. So here we get a whole number of Sanskrit equivalents which are really reliable. What do we do then? We've got the Sanskrit equivalent. Well, we have to look, in many cases, in various dictionaries. The Buddhist Hybrid Sanskrit Dictionary, which is also on the resources that we're going to have here at the TBRC, by Edgerton, is extremely valuable. It gives material from the Mahavyutpati. It gives other canonical texts to show how a term is being used, and it also gives Pali equivalents. In many cases, it's useful to look in a Pali dictionary, the Pali English Dictionary of the Pali Text Society. That's also going to be available on our resources. In short, in many cases, we'll have well-known translational equivalents in Tibetan, which we can say with a good level of confidence corresponds to such and such a Sanskrit term and to such and such a canonical concept. There are a lot of them. And sometimes that Sanskrit will yield a somewhat different angle on the term. Okay, so I've spoken of the Mahavyutpati. The Mahavyutpati is, by the way, also contained in Lokesh Chandra's Sanskrit Tibetan Sanskrit Dictionary. That is the Mahavyutpati going from Tibetan to Sanskrit, but not in the other order. The Lokesh Chandra, you have to use that with a certain amount of discernment and wisdom, because there are many, many other equivalences. You have to know, in a sense, what you're dealing with. If we take, for example, I don't know, the first thing that comes to my mind is, if we take, for example, the term in Tibetan, Shemba. Shemba will have the sense of attachment, as in Mumba Shemba, Abhinivesha in Sanskrit. But it also has a quite a different sense. It's, in a sense, a polysemic term representing two Sanskrit notions. And the second one is Adhyavasaya, Adhyavaso, Adhyavasyati, meaning to decide, to resolve, to determine. This, by the way, for example, is the sense of Shenba that you have when you have Shenyu, an object which is to be determined, an Adhyavasaya, an Adhyavaseya. So one has to use these things with a certain amount of discernment. Lokesh Chandra, the Buddhist Hybrid Sanskrit Dictionary, the Pali English Dictionary, the Mahavyutpati. Besides that, we have, and we're putting on the TBRC for vocabulary, various glossaries which have been done largely by Japanese on particular texts. One of the more interesting ones and extremely useful is that of Hirakawa, Akira, which is the glossary, the Sanskrit, Tibetan, Chinese glossary to the Abhidhamma Kosha. So it enables you to get, in this particular case, equivalences between Sanskrit and Tibetan, but also between Sanskrit and Chinese, and looking at the different translations in that particular case, Shenzhen and Paramartha. Now we have glossaries then by Nagao, Gajin Nagao. We'll have the index to the traité of Etienne Lamotte. We'll also have certain key works, for example, an English translation of L'Histoire du Bouddhisme Indien, the history of Indian Buddhism by Etienne Lamotte, and the English translation of Louis Laval-Poussin's work on the Abhidharma Kosha, and